So you can look at the Commonwealth of Virginia, and for instance, when we were debating issues such as unemployment rates in the Senate, and they would look at each state by state, you can see the great difference in different parts of the same Commonwealth based on patterns that go back hundreds of years. And if you look at the election cycles, you can see the impact of those migrations as well, and the breakdowns, particularly over the last 2 election cycles in terms of how people have voted. I'm here today to talk to you really about the concerns that I have for our country and why I have been speaking about these issues more directly since May, and why we decided not too long ago that we would put together an exploratory committee with respect to the possibility of running for the candidacy of the Democratic Party for President of the United States. I'm very concerned about our country on a number of different levels. And when I look at the political themes that dominate our discussions today, I can go back to the time 8 years ago when I was running for the Senate, and they're basically the same thematic issues. We need to reorient our national security policy. Our national security policy and our foreign policy has in many ways been on autopilot since 9/11. We need to have a revamping of America's definition of its national security interests around the world. We're going to need to reshape the United States military more in line with those strategic objectives, and we're going to have a strong debate about the power of the presidency when it comes to the unilateral use of military force around the world. I spoke on these issues consistently when I was in the United States Senate. We led from our office what had become now called the pivot to Asia. I spent a lot of time in Asia over my professional life as a journalist and as a business person and as a government official. I was one of the voices which, in terms of the incursion into Libya, were trying to say that this was not the proper way for the President of the United States to unilaterally use military force. Secondly, as it ties into this, I think we need to have a strong examination of the roles in our federal system that are played by the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, particularly the legislative versus the executive branches of government. Since 9/11, beginning for a lot of understandable reasons, given a period of national crisis, a lot of powers moved to the presidency in terms of particularly the use of military force, and but also in other areas. And we need to examine that. Third, in an area that I call social justice, we have a national crisis on our hands in terms of our criminal justice system. And I started talking about this when I was running for the Senate here in Virginia. I was talking about the impact of mass incarceration, the impact of putting so many people in prison for nonviolent offenses when there might be other alternatives, but also the worries that people still have in our communities about the safety of their communities. We were seeing, on the one hand, more and more people in prison, and on the other hand, you take a survey, and the people in their neighborhoods felt less and less secure. And I started talking when I was running for the Senate, saying this is not a political problem. This is a leadership problem. We need to get our arms around it. and try to find solutions. We did that after I was elected. For 2.5 years. We took this issue on directly in our office. We held hearings on the Joint Economic Committees about the impact of mass incarceration, the impact of drugs policies from point of origin to point of use, questions such as the rise in gangs in different communities. And after 2.5 years, we put together a piece of legislation calling for a national commission to examine all of the aspects of the criminal justice system from point of apprehension through point of re-entry into society for those who have been in prison who want to properly re-enter, and I think that is most of the people who have been in prison. We still need to work on that. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's known prison population, and at the same time, we have about 7 million people who have been involved in the criminal justice system in one way or another, many of them who are marked for life with the stigma of having been in prison. During the time that I was in the Senate, I visited the Richmond jail. And I'll tell you, if anybody wants an eye-opener about what incarceration can do to an individual for the rest of their lives, just go over there and visit it. Just go over there and take a look and walk around and see the conditions under which these people are incarcerated. As I said, I'm not saying this as simply as someone who might be perceived as soft on crime. I'm seeing this as someone who is trying to look for a proper way for us to address the issues of crime in our society and allow those who have been inside the criminal justice system to find a way to re-enter our society and become productive again. And the final issue that we addressed then and that I have addressed consistently since then is the issue of economic fairness in our society. When I was running for the Senate, John Edwards had been running for president on a campaign policy of the two Americas, and I was saying, no, there's three Americas. We have the people in the middle who are largely carrying a load. We have the people at the bottom who are in a safety net. We're going to take care of them. We want to get them out of the bottom. We want the American dream for everyone. And we have a strata of people at the very top who, for a complicated set of reasons, have grown further and further away from the rest of our society. And we need to find proper avenues in terms of government policy to make sure that equal opportunity and economic fairness can exist. When the economy crashed, right at the end of 2008, right before the election of 2008, it bottomed out in about April of 2009 and started this economic recovery. If you take a look at the numbers since April 2009, the stock market has nearly tripled during that period. Yesterday, it was about 17,800. I think it was a little above, maybe a 6,400, somewhere in there in April of 2009. At the same time, if you look at real wages for working people, they've actually, according to the Wall Street Journal, dropped just a bit. And if you look at loans that are available to small businesses, they have dropped by about, I think, 8%, according to the Wall Street Journal. So we actually have seen an economic recovery for those who have assets. If you have assets, if you can invest, if you have capital, if you can invest with the very low interest rates that exist in our country and the stock market, which has been on a roll, you are making money. If you don't have assets, you're not making money. At the same time, I think as everyone in this room knows, the tax rate on capital gains, on passive income you gain from stocks, is low. It's lower than the tax rate on a lot of earned income, people who go out and earn a wage. So there has to be a way without slowing down the ability of those in our society who are the risk takers and the profit makers. There has to be a way to make sure that people are equally paying their fair share of the obligations that we have to keep this country going. Those were the issues then. Those are the issues now. As we move forward here in the next few months, I'm listening to people, talking with people, looking for solutions, and looking for ways that we might contribute further to the national discussion. And with that, I will take your questions. Yes, sir.
You were a reluctant candidate when you ran for the Senate. How would you deal with being a national candidate, having to go into all these primary states and spend 300 or 400, 300 nights a year in a Holiday Inn?
Did everybody hear the question? Because I'm not sure. The question was, I was a reluctant candidate in '06, and how would I deal with 300 or so nights a year in the Holiday Inn as a national candidate? The first thing I would say is I am not a career politician. I'm not. This is not a planned trajectory, nor was it a planned trajectory when I decided to run for the Senate in '06. I think if people will examine what we were able to do in '06, then perhaps they can understand that if I do commit myself to something, I'll commit myself 100%. We announced in 2006, we announced 9 months to the day before the election. We had no money. We had no campaign staff. We were behind 33 points in the polls from an established incumbent who had just gotten the highest number of votes for president at the Conservative Political Action Conference. And we stayed at it. And I had, by the way, I had a contested primary before the general election. There was concern inside the Democratic Party that here, someone coming in who had worked in the Reagan administration was going to run as a Democrat. So we were out every day, every night, sometimes 3 events a night for the primary and for the general. So if I commit myself to something, I will see it through. Going once? Okay, someone, yes, sir.
What's your timetable? When are you going to be making decisions early this year? What's the progress?
All right, questions on the timetable. Here's what we decided to do. When I left the Senate, I have a lot of friends and people that I've known for years in the room here. We made a decision that I would do no media for more than a year. I did no interviews. I wrote no op-eds. Completely stayed away. Wrote a book. Kind of, frankly, wanted to get my political independence back, etc. And once I started doing events again, when my book came out, we got a lot of emails and other communications asking that we consider the running for the presidency. And so after a good deal of thought, the best way forward in the situation that I am in, I'm not an incumbent, would be to put together an organizing committee and to test the support levels of the people who have said that they would like us to run. So we're going to be looking at this over the next few months, and as I said, I'm meeting with different people, listening to them, and if we get the right kind of support and the right kind of financial backing, then we'll move forward. So we'll make a decision at the appropriate time on that.
Does that mean in the next few months you're going to make a decision?
We will look at this over the next few months, and the decision will come when I feel comfortable with it. Yes, in the back.
If you did decide to run, what qualities
I don't want to put myself in the position of commenting on any other candidate, but I will say that I believe that the experiences that I have in my life in terms of leadership, a sense of history, the different things that I have done have helped me understand the issues in a way that I believe I could effectively lead. Yes, sir. We're making this decision based on our own analytics. Yes, sir.
Why did you decide not to run for re-election in the Senate?
If you look at my professional career, it has been spent almost half and half between public service and doing other things. And quite frankly, I think that's healthy. I spent time in the Marine Corps. Then I left, went to law school, did some writing, worked as a military planner, came back in, spent 4 years as a committee counsel in the Congress. I was invited at that point to come into the Reagan administration, and I did some more writing. I went out, I was a journalist in Beirut when the Marines were in Beirut. And actually, this is kind of an explanatory pattern here. When I decided to come into the Reagan administration after the building blew up in Beirut. Those of you who remember that, October 23rd, 1983, we lost 240 Americans in one day, and I had just returned from Beirut covering it for PBS. And I said, all right, I want to stick my oar in the water again. I want to get back in and help. And went into the Reagan administration for 4 years, actually to the day, 4 years, and then felt the urge to go back out and do more writing and other things. And in '06, I had watched what was happening from 9/11 forward, internationally and domestically, and had grown more and more concerned about the leadership decisions that were being made. And actually the last straw for me, when I decided that I would pursue running for the Senate, was watching the mismanagement after Hurricane Katrina. My wife's family is from New Orleans, and I was on the phone with them constantly while this was going on. And there were better ways that proper leadership could have handled that whole crisis down there. My pattern at the time looking at it was, if you look at the evacuation of Saigon in 1975, we got hundreds of thousands of people out of that war zone in a couple of weeks. We got them into refugee camps, including my wife's family. They got out on a boat, were rescued by the Navy, went to Guam. Just north of New Orleans, there's an army base called Fort Polk. It had 330 square miles of territory up there. It would have been so simple as a former Assistant Secretary of Defense responsible for a lot of these emergency FEMA-type situations, to get those people out of New Orleans, get them up in Fort Polk, get them in a temporary camp area, tent city type area, feed them until they could go back. And I just said, if we can't manage a war, and if this is what we're doing in a crisis, I'm sitting out here looking at it, I should be in attempting to help solve the problems. That was the motivation when I decided to run. After 6 years, and we had 6 good years, the Senate, it became a very frustrating place in terms of a lot of issues, but the issues that we cared about, we did a lot of good for our country, and I was very proud of it. But when it got to the end of 6 years, I said the same thing again. I come from a family that's got a citizen soldier tradition. 6 years is good. 6 years is a term and a half of a presidency. It's not exactly a short period of time, but it was an appropriate time to take a step back again and to look at things. And I have done that, and I see areas where I believe that with the background that I have and the leadership skills that I have been involved with from the time I was a kid, growing up inside the military, might be able to help the country move forward. So we're looking at it, but that is, I think in terms of spending one term in the Senate, I think that was appropriate for the professional life that I've lived at this point.
Hey, quick insert here. Could you wait to ask your question until I get the mic to you? That way everybody can hear the question.
Okay, and I will repeat them in short order. I'm not sure how to, there are a lot of hands up. I don't know, you want to, yes, sir.
You hear from a lot of candidates that priority is in reducing the debt by some means or another. We don't hear that from you. And is that a priority with you? And secondly, can that be done in a way that fosters economic fairness?
I think everybody heard that question. Well, I think certainly we need to tighten the federal budget where appropriate. And one of the things that can be done early on is to basically audit every federal agency in terms of their programs and have them re-justify programs. In terms of the national debt writ large, that's something that I would work with people on both sides of the aisle to address. But I think Ronald Reagan approved increases in the national debt as appropriate more than, well, let's just say several dozen times during his administration. And one of the biggest scares that we had when I was in the Senate was when the debate over the national debt almost pushed the economy over the cliff. And I can tell you, I went from those debates to a trip in East Asia, and there was just a tremendous amount of anxiety about the prospect that we might do that. So those I care about fiscal responsibility, and I think we need to look at tax reform overall in a streamlined way. I personally would support the notion of reducing the corporate tax, eliminating loopholes, at the same time increasing capital gains tax. But to just focus in on one part of the problem, I don't think is the best way to go. Yes, sir, all the way back.
It's been a little over 4.5 years since Congress passed the Affordable Care Act and the President signed it. It's remained a politically and socially divisive issue since. It's played a role in numerous elections, including the last cycle. How do you look back on your vote on the law and the way the law has been implemented and the issue of fairness in the way it's been implemented?
Well, thank you. Let me start off with what I think is one of the key parts of the Affordable Care Act, the process that we went through. I believe that the timing in terms of bringing this legislation up was bad. I said so at the time. I went to the president and told him in June. It was in terms of its magnitude, it was out of sync with what the American people were undergoing when the economic recession had hit a couple of months before. It was a great idea maybe during a campaign, but given the economic situation, it was not the time to bring it up. The second piece of this, and I've said this numerous times while I was in the Senate, was that when you have a piece of legislation that is this complex and far-reaching, the administration should propose legislation, specific legislation, and the Congress should dispose, to quote from Senator Bob Dole on another issue. This legislation boiled up through 5 different congressional committees, 3 on the House side and 2 on the Senate side. people apparently were afraid that they would have a Hillary care situation from the Clinton administration where they had 1,100 pages of proposed laws bouncing around. We ended up with 7,000 pages, scaring the American people, and actually, I think, serving as the catalyst for the Tea Party movement and all these town hall meetings and everything that occurred during the summer of 2009. I went to the White House in May, and I said, "This is a disaster. You know, you've got to get your arms around this." When we had the votes on the legislation, I voted with the Republicans 18 times. I voted for final passage. At the time, hoping, and I still hope, that we can put the fixes in that will make this a better law. But doing something at that point was better than doing nothing. And, you know, when I went in to vote, that's the hardest vote I took in the Senate. When I went in to vote, here's one thing that was on my mind. My mother was one of 8 kids in East Arkansas. 3 out of her 8 siblings died in childhood, not childbirth, childhood, because there was not medical care available to them. And there are a lot of people in the country who need the kind of medical services that were not available to them. Do I think we should fix this? Yes, and I think that's where the discussion should go. Let's sit down with the membership of both parties and clean this legislation up. I think the best set of floor remarks when this legislation was being debated came from Orrin Hatch, Republican senator from Utah, who was a colleague and a friend. And Orrin Hatch stood up and he said, you know, if we're going to pass something this complex, we should have 70 votes, not 60. We should have 70 votes. And Hatch mentioned that he had frequently worked with Ted Kennedy on different pieces of legislation, reaching across not only the party divide, but the philosophical divide. So the best thing for us to do right now is let's fix it. Let's fix it. Yes, sir.
What should the nation do to resolve the intractable problem on immigration, particularly the 12 million undocumented people who are here in the country?
Okay, the questions on immigration. Let me make three points about where I see us on immigration right now. The first is, was the announcement of the president within his legal parameters? And as I look at this, I would have to say yes. There may be a lawsuit based on the size of the group that he decided not to prosecute, whether that is in some way violative of existing law. But it appears to me that he did have the legal authority to postpone the deportation of people for 3 years, which is essentially what he did, apparently approximately 5 million. It has further implications, but was that action within his parameters? I believe that it was. The second question we have to address as a country is, what are we going to do with this large illegal population that now resides inside the country? And let's remember that many of these people have come over a period since 1986, 1987, when the Simpson-Mazzoli law was passed and supposedly our immigration problems were going to be solved. We were very lax on our immigration policies. People came in. Many of them made their homes here for a long period of time, got good jobs. So you can go up to the area where I live in Falls Church, and we have communities all around us where people really have made lives in America. I introduced legislation during the 2007 immigration bill saying that if people have been here a certain period of time, as I recall it was 5 years, and they met some specific parameters, they could move forward towards citizenship, but we had to zero base the incoming immigration problem. The third observation that I would make on this is what are we now going to do? What are we going to do in the future with respect to our immigration policies? And I think there are a number of issues that need to be put on the table, not simply things like putting up a fence, but really, what should our policies be? Can we match our immigration policies with the needs of the United States economically and in terms of our view of humanitarian issues around the world? If we can move in that direction, then we can probably, hopefully, have a trade-off on the issue of the people who have been here for a considerable period of time. I think we should work on that. I have my thoughts, but I don't want to put half of them out here and then, you know. Yes, sir.
Senator, you say you'll base this decision to run for president off your own analytics. Well, your own analysis must show that top Democrats here in Virginia, from Governor Terry McAuliffe to Senator Tim Kaine, have already expressed support for Hillary Clinton. Do you think you need to have support here at home before you can run a nationwide presidential campaign?
Frankly, no. You know, everyone has their own agenda. Everyone has their, their own political affiliations. I'm not offended by other people's endorsements or how they may see their own futures. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier reshaping the military. Could you talk a little bit about what you'd like to see there and whether you support another BRAC round?
Good. I didn't hear the last part, and whether I support
a BRAC round.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We need, let me just say, traditionally, if we're doing things right, we shape our military off of our national security strategy. We develop a strategy, then we say, how are we going to implement that strategy? Now, when you have these periods of long incursions in ground wars, the strategy can become skewed, even inside the military, where they lose their doctrinal traditions and adapt to, urban warfare in Iraq or, these situations out in the remote areas in Afghanistan. So the first thing we need to do is get a clear enunciation of what our national security policy is. We need a doctrine, quite frankly. The last really clear doctrine we've had was the Nixon doctrine that was enunciated in 1969 that said we will provide nuclear umbrella for our friends and our allies. We will live up to our treaty commitments. We will not get involved in local wars. We will assist our allies if they are involved in those situations. We need something similar in more detail. We need to focus on East Asia. One thing that happens when you get these multiple long-term engagements like Afghanistan and Iraq is the strategic forces in the military tend to dwindle. So if you're projecting those sets of parameters, what you would come up with, I think, is we're going to have to live with a smaller army. They're already looking at that. A more streamlined Marine Corps, increase the strategic forces. I would say hold fast and increase the Navy, particularly for the interest in East Asia. And let's not forget how important strategically East Asia is to this country and to other regions of the world. If you look at the Strait of Malacca, thousands of ships go through the Strait of Malacca every year, up into the ports in Korea, China, Japan, recently now Vietnam, Singapore, obviously. China itself has been expanding its claims and sovereignty in the South China Sea. So strategically, long-term strategy, that's a vital place for the military. We need to be able to project our forces in hot spots, but we don't need to be an occupying power in some of the places where we have been. So those are the parameters that we would be looking at in terms of reshaping the military.
Senator, playing off that question, national security, right now it seems like one of the huge components of national security is a very aggressive NSA, including both domestic and foreign surveillance. What do you think about the role of NSA, and what would it look like in a Webb administration?
The role that NSA plays is vital to our security. The challenge that we have is to make sure that people who are not engaged in terrorist or illegal activities under the purview of the NSA do not have their personal lives impacted by how this information is collected and stored. And I think that's a real concern. I introduced, along with Senator Russ Feingold, 2 different amendments during the FISA, Foreign Intelligence Service Act, in 07, basically saying we understand what the requirements are in terms of collecting information and analyzing it, but there is no reason to store all this personal information about people beyond a certain point. The legislation failed, but I think it's important as Americans come to understand more and more how much of their personal information is out there in some place that violates their natural expectations of privacy. So on the one hand, we know that this is a vital mission. For instance, if somebody's going to try to send a piece of terrorist-oriented information from, say, Spain, they can choose 1,000 different email addresses, the only one of which is the one that should go through. And you can't have, as some people were arguing, you can't have a wiretap application on every one of those. You just can't do it in the modern age. But once that information has been collected, if there's nothing in there that is directly relevant to their mission, that information should be destroyed. Yes. Well, let me say 2 things about the polarization in our country right now. First, in terms of getting things done. You can get things done. The last 2 years have been probably as bad as I've seen it, at least in my adult lifetime, in terms of not getting anything done. But we were able, during my time in the Senate, to move the issues that we cared about to the Senate floor. I know Senator Begich of Alaska had made a comment during his campaign that he hadn't had one amendment in 6 years reach the Senate floor. Well, we did. Some of them we won, some of them we didn't. The one that I'm the proudest of, obviously, is the GI Bill. I wrote the GI Bill with legislative counsel before I was sworn in as a senator. I'd been talking about it for years. It's the best GI Bill in history. I modeled it on the World War II GI Bill, which I learned about when I was a committee counsel many years ago. We worked across the aisle. We got 2 Republican senators, one of them John Warner, whom I greatly admire, who was senior senator from Virginia at the time. We had 2 Democrats, myself and Senator Frank Lautenberg from New Jersey, 2 World War II veterans, 2 Vietnam veterans. And in 16 months, we passed that legislation. It's the most comprehensive piece of veterans legislation since World War II. We sat down with people. We listened to them. We did the same thing on the criminal justice legislation that we put together. We worked with more than 100 different associations from across the philosophical spectrum, getting their viewpoints on the legislation. We got buy-ins from all the way from the National Sheriff's Association to the Marijuana Project. I think that's the only time both of those associations have ever been on one piece of legislation. And we got it to the floor. And we got it to the floor in a time when everything was being frozen. We still got 57 votes. We needed 60, which the National Review Online of all publications said the Republicans were insane to filibuster this particular piece of legislation, $14 million sunsetted legislation. But we got that issue into the national debate. When I first started talking about criminal justice reform, people were saying I was committing political suicide. Now, the Conservative Political Action Conference ranked it as one of its top 3 political issues this last year. Rand Paul's going around talking about it. You know, we're going to get answers on the issue. If you're going to lead, you take a risk, you put something on the table, you fight for it, and you see, you listen to people who have other ideas, and you see if you can't get something done. And I think that can be done now. We need to rely on the goodwill of the people who have been elected to office and work with them. And the system just, as I've watched over the last 3 or 4 years, has just stopped doing that. But that doesn't mean you have to keep. It doesn't mean you have to keep not doing it, which is basically where they are. The second thing I would say about the political paralysis is that I think if you look at the voting patterns, the concern that I have, quite frankly, is that the Democratic Party has lost the message that made it such a great party for so many years. And that message was, take care of working people, take care of the people who have no voice in the corridors of power, no matter their race, ethnicity, or any other reason. The Democratic Party has basically turned into a party of interest groups. And if you look at the vote in this last election, you'll see that white working people overwhelmingly rejected the party that should be addressing their interests. I think Mary Landrieu got 18% of the white vote. I think that Kay Hagan got 33%. And so we're in this kind of regrettable situation where the parties are starting to fall apart based on race, which I think is harmful for the country. And the very people who would have a natural affinity for what the Democratic Party used to offer feel alienated. If they feel the Democratic Party doesn't want them. I'll tell you what the Democratic Party did that my family always remembered. You know, when my grandfather died in East Arkansas, my mother was 10 years old. They were living in utter poverty. One of my mother's long memories from that period was that my grandmother had to go out and take feed corn out of a field that was being grown for stock animals and bring it home and mix it in lard and feed the family. Franklin Roosevelt, 1938, he was not a Southerner, but he saw the economic devastation of the American South that had gone on for 7 decades after the Civil War. And he asked for a report. I have read this report. If anyone here is really interested in history, find this report. It's called A Report on the Economic Conditions of the South. 1938, Roosevelt said, the economic conditions of the South are the country's #1 economic problem. Let's fix it. He went in. We saw TVA built, where my mother's family was living. They put in an artillery factory in North Little Rock, and my grandmother found a job making artillery shells. People remembered that Roosevelt cared about the people who had no hope. And that's what needs to happen again in this country.
And we are getting close on time. I think we have maybe about 3 or so minutes left. So maybe I know Alan's been waiting here for one question. Maybe we have time for one more after that. But I'm going to pass it off to Alan here.
Hi. I know you said you didn't want to comment on other candidates, but I thought I'd try anyway. How specifically are you different from a Hillary Clinton presidency or a Hillary candidacy? I mean, what's the difference between you and her? She, her.
I don't think it's appropriate for me to answer that. Yes. Are you, or, well, we have, okay, one more, then we do have to go. I appreciate your patience. All right, thank you very much. Good to be with you.